This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. It's not hyperbole to say that Vietnam is in the midst of a defining moment that will determine its future. After an astonishing 30-year run that saw the country go from among the poorest in the world to an economic darling hailed as the potential next big thing, the limits of its export-oriented growth model are starting to show. While GDP growth remains the envy of most governments, it's off target if Vietnam is to become a high-income country by 2050, as mandated by top leaders. Heavy reliance on FDI manufacturing and trade has exposed the economy to the whims of geopolitics, while the domestic private sector has largely failed to break out beyond Vietnam's borders. If the classic Asian tigers of South Korea and Taiwan are serving as a model, Vietnam is not seeing a similar rise of homegrown powerhouses like Samsung or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. Of course, those countries modernize under far different international circumstances. In recent months, it has become abundantly clear that Vietnam's leadership recognizes this. Top officials have discussed the need to avoid the dreaded middle income trap, which regional peers like Malaysia and especially Thailand have fallen into. No offense to Malaysia or Thailand. General Secretary To Lam, along with Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh, have spearheaded a staggering array of ambitious efforts, including a historic bureaucratic overhaul that will eliminate over 100,000 public sector jobs at an entire level of government, a geographic merger that will reduce the number of provinces from 63 to 34, the elevation of the domestic private sector, the reintroduction of nuclear energy planning, the development of a major semiconductor industry, the construction of a national high-speed rail line, and more. Taken together, this may be the most pivotal year for modern Vietnam's development since Doi Moi began in 1986, and it's all in the name of setting the country up for its next 30 years and beyond of growth. It can be difficult to keep track of all this, but today's guest is someone who does just that. Rich McClellan is founder and principal of RMAC Advisory and former country director of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in Vietnam. He's an expert in public policy, investment, and economic reform across emerging markets. We cover The Economist's much discussed recent cover story on Vietnam, the country's International Finance Center ambitions, Resolution 68 and its focus on the domestic private sector, the ongoing government restructuring and provincial merger, and the genuinely exciting place that Vietnam finds itself in at the moment. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarsky@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Rich. Rich, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. My pleasure to be here, Mike.
Yeah, so you've been on my guest list for a while. I know you've been involved or are involved in quite a few different interesting topics. I think we'll get to a few of those today, but I thought we could start, it's a little over a week since The Economist published their big cover reporting package on Vietnam, which I assume like you, or like me, your LinkedIn was probably full of people commenting on it. I know you had a post as well. But yeah, obviously got a ton of attention, and I think for people who are close observers of Vietnam like you, was surely interesting. But anyway, your post kind of said that it aligned with what the kind of points you've been making for I guess most of this year or even longer probably. Would you mind outlining some of those points?
Yeah, sure. It'd be my pleasure. I mean, there are obviously some nuances in the article I may disagree with, but the overall tenor of the article certainly set the stage for sort of the basket of opportunities and challenges that I think Vietnam is looking at right now. And basically the way I've been telling the story for all of this year so far has been to say, situation, complication, resolution, right? Situation is Vietnam has been growing at a mighty fast clip for 20, 25 years now, 5 to 8% growth. Absolutely extraordinary. And if we can continue that growth rate for just another 15 years, this will be a fully developed economy. That's pretty remarkable. It means we're 65, 70% of the way through the journey already. That's super exciting. The complication, though, is that the growth model that's gotten us to where we're at today probably only has 3 to 4 years of growth left in it. It will not take us for another 15 years. And so there's a need to radically and quickly sort of reframe and readjust that growth model so that the country can move what development people call past the middle income trap, right? There's a space where most countries' growth sort of peters out, and we're right at right at that space right now because they cannot complexify the economy quickly enough, and they cannot sort of move from the sort of low value add manufacturing, export-led growth into sort of a more fleshed out and self-sufficient economy. If we look at the other Asian tigers as an example, right, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, Hong Kong, these countries are the ones that have actually, defied the odds, skipped the middle income trap, and moved to the next level. And each of them did that by making a great big bet on a particular section of the economy. They had the policy alignment, they had the political will, they had everything lined up so that they could move big on something really big. The problem is Vietnam is significantly larger than any of those Asian tigers were when they went through that process, significantly larger and significantly more complex in terms of its stakeholders, in terms of its decision-making structures, those kinds of things. So I would posit that instead of sort of one big bet, Vietnam needs 6 or 7 big bets really in order to make that leap past the middle income trap. And we're seeing those things happen, right? We'll talk about a few of these today, I think, but certainly we're seeing the push for a financial center in Vietnam, the push for semiconductors, the push for the high-speed rail, deep sea ports, even the nuclear push. All of these things, each of them are massive change opportunities for an economy that is in development and needs to go big. And so they're making a bunch of these bets all at once. And I think what's got me most excited over the last year as I've watched is that it's become pretty clear that leadership gets all of this narrative and that they are aligning themselves to be able to actually accomplish this. I think if you had asked me 2 years ago, will Vietnam be able to skip the middle income trap? I'm an eternal optimist, right? I'm always going to be like, oh yeah, of course we've got, but I would have said, I really hope so. I really hope so. But if you ask me today, I say, I think so. This is an actual real possibility at this stage. And it's because of the new momentum that the new leadership of the country has brought in. We haven't changed really any of the policies of the countries, but we've accelerated the pace of reforms of the country. And so if you pair all of this conversation, this whole arc that I've just painted for you, up with the institutional reforms that were announced late last year and have been very quickly rolled out, these are at the same scale of disruption and change as what we saw with DOGE in the US over the last several months. But they're being handled in a much more thoughtful and well-planned, well-executed way that isn't creating a lot of enemies and is preparing to lay the groundwork. These are the bureaucracy in Vietnam. Previously, I would say was a real bottleneck for the kind of growth that it needs to achieve. And this has laid the groundwork for being able to remove and slim down and make more efficient the government infrastructure that's required to support that kind of growth. So that's the way I would sort of repaint that narrative for what we read in the Economist article last week.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the recognition among the leadership that you can see in state media has been striking. I mean, that, I think there's been explicit mentions of the middle income trap. Obviously, officials are well aware of the chance of, becoming Malaysia or Thailand, both of which are obviously perfectly nice countries, but are not Taiwan or South Korea or something like that. And then, yeah, the kind of all of these ambitions going on at once, any one of which, the ones you mentioned, any one of which could be an episode of their own. Some of basically have been already. But you mentioned the International Finance Center, which I know is something you put a lot of work into at the Tony Blair Institute, and I imagine are still working on. Could you kind of outline what those ambitions are? Or I guess for starters, what exactly is an International Finance Center? It's kind of a vague vague term, almost to the point of meaninglessness. And then also, like, what are Vietnam's goals and why are they important?
No, I think that's a great question, Mike. Thanks for starting with that, because it is a little vague when you say International Financial Center. For some people, when you say IFC, what pops into their brain is the Dubai IFC as sort of the gold standard of this entity that was sort of created out of nowhere and has been built up and has created a ton of cash flows for the Emirates. But that's not what an IFC is. That's not the only model of an IFC, and it's actually not even the most prominent model of an IFC. New York City is an IFC, London is an IFC, Singapore is an IFC, Hong Kong is an IFC. IFC simply means a place where a lot of sort of finance and banking related stuff happens that's quite international in nature, right? And so, of course, London is the oldest and New York is the biggest. Having an international financial center means that you are a place where a lot of global capital likes to flow through. Certainly, some of these have been purposefully engineered over the last 30 or 40 years at varying degrees of success, right? I mentioned already the Dubai IFC, but also right next door to it, Abu Dhabi Global Markets is another IFC that's only an hour away and has a different flavor as well. But the idea of having an IFC is simply that we want to be participating and active in global capital flows. To be clear, Ho Chi Minh City actually already is technically rated as an IFC. It's very close to the bottom. There's a global IFC rankings index put together out of London. And the last few years, Ho Chi Minh City has been rated on it. But to say that Ho Chi Minh City already really is a player in international finance, I would say would be a bit of a stretch. And so the ambition here, I think, is twofold. One is really, let's start being a player in the global financial markets. But two is, let's also ensure that Vietnam has a legal and financial architecture that will allow it to mature to the next generation. And what I mean by that is, if you look at sort of where Singapore was even 30 or 35 years ago, it actually wasn't that different from Vietnam today in terms of how conservative the banking sector was, in terms of many of the rules that they had on international capital flows. But they very purposefully rolled out a series of reforms that allowed them to become more and more liberalized and more internationalized, and would now stand as one of the most liberal capital markets on the planet. And so it was a very purposeful journey that they went down. It wasn't the same path that Dubai took, where they carved out a specific geographic space and declared it to be a financial center with entirely different laws, entirely different court systems and everything like that. But it was a purposeful path that the Singaporean government took. And I think that's what we're seeing happen in Vietnam, is basically using the idea of an international financial center to drive a series of reforms that will not just attract international capital, but also will bless the rest of the country in the long run, in terms of making it a place where business can be done in a more transparent and more efficient way at standards that look more like global standards.
And that, I mean, yeah, you mentioned Ho Chi Minh City, technically kind of already rated as an IFC, but I know the government ambitions are for Ho Chi Minh City to, I guess, to truly be an international. I don't know what their definition or parameters are officially, but for Ho Chi Minh City to be an international IFC, and then I think Da Nang to be a regional, I suppose, Southeast Asia financial center. I'm sure there's many steps, but what are some of the main things that need to be done for those ambitions to be realized?
Well, first, let me sort of update the thinking on that. So that was how it was first announced by the Politburo last fall. The most recent thinking on this has changed just slightly, and it's subtle, but I think it's important. Rather than saying we're going to have two IFCs in Vietnam, one sort of more international, one sort of more regionally focused, they're now saying we're going to have one IFC in Vietnam that is housed in two locations, right? And so that has a different set of implications for how it's going to be designed, how it's going to be operated and administered, and all of that. But in theory, it's still essentially the same sort of target that we're looking at. It's been under discussion for 3 or 4 years. The momentum really picked up, I think it was October or November of last year, with the issuance of the Politburo resolution on the topic, which really sort of laid out a very specific roadmap and path forward for the government to take. Basically, ordering the government to establish Ho Chi Minh City and Da Nang as an IFC, and also listing out the kinds of reforms that it expects to see taking place inside of this IFC. And so now we're in the stage where the National Assembly has picked up and is carrying it forward. There's a resolution that's likely to be voted on by the end of this month that will be the sort of foundational legislative framework. But after that, there will be a whole series of decrees that will need to be made to support that and provide further detail. From a legislative process perspective, essentially, this resolution is meant to be purposefully a bit of a specifying framework to tell them what needs to be done, but also a little light touch because it wants to leave space for the provinces to really sort of adapt and design those financial centers to the needs of the markets and in response to the private sector as the private sector demonstrates what they prefer. And so it's going to move from sort of a Hanoi-led initiative to a Ho Chi Minh and Danang-led initiative over the course of the next 9 months, let's say. But I suspect that the iterations on policies and regulations and decrees will be going forward for at least the next year or so before we're going to see sort of real hardcore traction on the ground in each of these locations, before we see real development deals being signed and we see people starting to stand up a lot of new buildings and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of a long process, although, I mean, certainly making progress on it. I mean, I guess, what do you see as as an eternal optimist, what are some of the main hurdles towards this? I mean, I know there's like big issues with capital controls. It's hard to get money out of the country, legally obtain money out of the country, which I imagine is something they're discussing. But what are a couple of the challenges here?
Well, there's a number of key reforms that I would point to that are most exciting. Let's say it this way: is that as you mentioned, it is difficult for international investors to be present in Vietnam. Most of the investment that's happening in Vietnam is really happening through Singapore as sort of a conduit into Vietnam because it's easier and it's a more familiar international legislative environment and more predictable and all of that. And so there are a number of reforms that have already been mandated by the party and are about to be enshrined in law that I would be most excited about. The first one is one that you just mentioned. Repatriation of profits has been historically difficult. It will now be much easier for companies to get their money back out after they've invested and earned something. I think another one is foreign exchange controls, being able to operate in U.S. dollars and being able to exchange currencies freely and openly will also be possible inside of the International Financial Center. Having an independent dispute resolution authority is going to be a very big deal. That's already been mandated. They are still considering the possibility of courts, an independent court system. That would be very exciting, but I would suspect that's going to take 10 years before that will materialize. That's one of the big differentiators, for instance, for the Dubai IFC, is that they have inside, and maybe it'd be useful for me if we want to talk a little bit more about sort of organization and administration, to lay out, as I mentioned, Dubai is sort of viewed often as the gold standard. But I would frame it more like Dubai is sort of the most extreme version of what you could do if you're building an international financial center.
Okay.
And what they've done is they got 3 separate entities that work in lockstep with each other, each of which is nearly 100% independent of the government of the United Arab Emirates and the city of Dubai. And those entities are first, you have an independent regulator, so that the rules that are being set up for how companies operate inside that financial center are independent of the rules that are set up for the rest of businesses in the United Arab Emirates. The second is an independent court system, as I alluded to a minute ago. And so they have judges that are international judges. They, operate on common law, and they are judging cases, they're writing contracts and all of this in the context of a completely independent court system, and not saying, you don't have that line that says, okay, this will all be taken care of by Vietnamese courts. And then the third, and this is the one that would be the visible one that most people would see, would be that they have basically a management company. And this is sort of the more private sector facing portion of the financial center, which they're responsible for real estate development. They're responsible for licensing and signing contracts with the different financial players who come into the financial center. They're responsible for marketing and investor attraction, and sort of all of that sort of business development function sits inside something that is far more private sector facing and more private sector motivated. Whereas then you separately have a regulator who sets the rules, and you separately have a court system to arbitrate. And so that would be sort of, as I said, the most extreme version of what's possible. And I think in Vietnam, we're going to see borrowed elements from some of that in terms of the overall design and philosophy, but we're not going to go as extreme as some of those concepts, at least not in the short term. So I think those are some of the main things that we're going to see in Vietnam's IFCs.
Great, super helpful. Definitely be interested to, or will be interested to see how this goes moving forward. And switching gears slightly to another big ambition that I think before the Economist story got published was the talk of LinkedIn at the very least, which is Resolution 68 that was issued, I guess, a few weeks ago now. At this point, which is kind of aimed at, or not kind of, is aimed at sort of unleashing the private sector here in Vietnam. So just a little bit of background: for the first time, I think designates the private, like the domestic private sector, not talking about FDI, as the most important driving force of the economy, which is a change from, I think it was previously officially considered like an important component or something like that, but now seen as the driving force. So that's a shift. It's got some concrete goals for 2030, like doubling the number of private enterprises, trying to get 20 large enterprises integrated into the global supply chain, which is something that Vietnam has really struggled with, even with all the manufacturing here. But anyway, this has been hailed far and wide as a huge step. So what are your thoughts on Resolution 68, and what should we kind of be on the lookout for in terms of action to, implement it?
Firstly, I would say Resolution 68 is most valuable for signaling. Right. Yes, there are some great specifics in there in terms of tax incentives and encouraging supply chains to get deeper here and things like that. But the biggest deal is just this clear message from the very top, right? We're evolving out of a system that at one point was entirely centrally managed and controlled, and has evolved over time. If you go back to the Doi Moi reforms until today, it's been quite the journey, right? Where you've seen the private sector taking on a greater and greater role. I think it's really exciting in particular because really it's the FDI that's driving the private sector in Vietnam today, or driving the economy in Vietnam today. And with the noise that we're seeing on tariffs right now, it just sort of reminds us that we can't always depend on FDI to be the driving force, and that at some point the economy has to stand up on its own and has to be able to be 100% self-sufficient. And the other so it's a step in strengthening and supporting the domestic private sector, not only in contrast to the foreign private sector, but also in contrast to the state-owned enterprises. And so for most of Vietnam's history, the state-owned enterprises have played a super fundamental and probably an outsized role in economic growth here. The challenge is that they grow at just a fraction of the rate that the private sector grows. They grow at 2 or 3 or 4% a year, where the private sector, overall Vietnam's hitting about 7 to 8%. But that's the FDI grows at 11 or 12%. The domestic private sector grows at 8 or 9%. The final segment would be the informal private sector, which is actually more similar to the SOEs, where it's a bit stagnant in terms of the growth by comparison. And so I think we're seeing a really explicit transition from government reliance on SOEs, or let's say different. There's a clear acknowledgement of what was already true, is that the SOEs are not driving growth, and they're not going to be the future of Vietnam. And so if you look at, other countries around here, like South Korea with the Chaebol, or like the Philippines with a couple of really big families whose businesses dominate the economy, I think we're going to see over the next 10 years that we transition. These national champions that they're pointing out in Resolution 68 are going to be the future of Vietnam's economy. And if you pay attention to who goes along with the prime minister or the party secretary or the different high-level government delegations to foreign countries, if you go back 10 years, it would have been the state-owned enterprises that would have showed up. And if you look at who the government turns to whenever they need something done economically, it would have been the state-owned enterprises. And I think what we're seeing now is a very clear pivot toward, the likes of Vingroup and FPT and Sobeco, Vietjet. Like, these are being viewed more and more as a national asset, and having closer and closer ties to government. And so I think we're going to see the acceleration and growth of some of these kinds of organizations. And I think we're seeing a clear desire on the part of the Vietnamese government to see these national champions emerge and to spread their wings outside of Vietnam. For most people who are casual observers of Vietnam, the only, they would have heard of Vietnam Airlines, they would have heard of Vingroup, and really nobody else, right? And I think the ambition of the Vietnamese government is that 10 years from now, there are 8 or 10 brands around the world that you can point to that were clearly, born and raised in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's it's been interesting to see how, well, you mentioned Vingroup and THACO, I know it's kind of an odd acronym, but the industrial company, they've both kind of responded to this to propose that they build the national high-speed rail projects. I mean, I know some of the numbers and timelines on that were a little bit eye-popping, but interesting to see for sure. And I mean, I have kind of wondered in the past, as the cities struggle with the metro projects and things like that, like why aren't they getting any of these private corporations that have tons of money, or at least seem like they have tons of money to get involved? So we'll see how that goes. But the reaction has certainly been incredibly positive overall. So clearly, this is something that people really wanted to see.
Yeah, and these companies clearly have many of their own challenges, right? In many ways, the domestic private sector in Vietnam is really only 25 years old, right? And so even our biggest, most impressive champions still have, wearing my management consulting hat, I could walk into many of these companies and point to a lot of opportunities for cost cutting or for growth or to do things more efficiently or to improve sort of how they operate. But I think the urgency is now to start to depend and rely on these companies as I said, as national assets, not just simply as private companies, but as something that is companies that are actively driving the economic agenda of Vietnam.
So yeah, we will also see how things progress with that. And I mean, you mentioned at the start, the string of other ambitions mentioned the high-speed rail, but semiconductors, obviously there's this massive political restructuring in the works, the provincial mergers, of these initiatives, or any I didn't name perhaps. What do you think is kind of the most pressing or most urgent as Vietnam is embarking on this kind of structural reorganization?
I'm happy that comments on the institutional reforms a little bit more and the provincial mergers, right? Like I said at the beginning, these are absolutely necessary for the health and well-being of Vietnam, and it's always painful, right? Of course, they're in the process of laying off 120,000 civil servants, but this is absolutely necessary given how challenging it is to do anything today, right? Consolidating our ministries and cleaning up sort of the structures in Hanoi, and then on a corollary basis in every province in the country, removing the district level so that there's fewer levels of government interacting and engaging. And then finally, the provincial merger. This is something I've been wishing for 5 or 6 years, right? It occurred to me a long time ago as an economic development professional that there's no way that Vietnam will be able to drive economic development to every corner of Vietnam if it keeps acting as 63 separate entities, right? And I don't know that a lot of people think about it this way, but when I look at the Doi Moi reforms, there were 2 massive pivots that they made away from what we might call sort of classical or principled communism, right, at the time of the Doi Moi. And one was, of course, to introduce the possibility of the private sector, but the second one was a heavy decentralization. Right. And so the authorities ever since the 80s, have not been entirely held in Hanoi, but many have been devolved to the provincial levels. A lot of the economic decision making actually happens in the provinces. And so when you look at opportunities to attract capital, opportunities to attract investment, you're looking at the provincial level, and you're expecting them to be able to go out into the world and to be able to tell their own story and to be able to compete with all the other provinces and to be able to sell a good story about themselves. But I mean, some of these provinces only had a couple 100,000 people. And so to expect that that level of talent exists in that small of a population is a little bit insane, let's say. And so, if you look at China, they're what, 11, 12, 13 times the size of Vietnam, and the number of provinces they have is in the 20s, right? And so or you look at the US, which is 3 times the size of Vietnam, and we have 50 states. So the natural next level down from national definitely need to be less than 63. So I'm very excited about the provincial restructuring. Again, it means a lot of pain in the short term, but it's in the medium term. And by medium term, I don't mean 3 to 5 years out. I mean, within a year, we're going to see efficiencies that we've not seen before. We're going to see government able to make decisions at a level that is sort of consistent with these new geographic boundaries. Even if you look at Ho Chi Minh City and adding Vung Tau, right, and being able to imagine the economic development corridor all the way down to the port system and to the ocean, that changes the way that the leadership of Ho Chi Minh City thinks about the problem, right? Or if you look at Da Nang, back to our 2 IFC locations, they now have Quang Nam as part of their sort of economic decision-making nexus. So they're no longer just focused on this one city. They're focused on all of the land associated with a larger area. And so I think it lifts the accountability, and it also allows you to draw on a larger pool of talent, and to have fewer employees who are paid higher, frankly, will also help address some of the other issues that exist in the system today. So I'm quite excited about the provincial consolidation. I'm quite excited about the institutional reforms from top of government all the way down to the local level. The amount of chaos that we're seeing, I had been saying, oh, we're going to see 6 to 9 months of difficulty as people sort out the new reality. Honestly, I've certainly heard a bunch of stories, but they're not nearly as bad as they could have been. It's actually not as chaotic as I would have imagined. So I think the government is navigating this quite gracefully and doing a pretty good job in making these changes that are structurally necessary if they're going to be organized enough and focused enough to skip the middle income trap. So I guess that's what I would say about that one. Semiconductors, of course, is an interesting piece. We know that the global value chains for semiconductors are moving aggressively, and that's somewhat because of Taiwan and China relationship, also now because of the US. Also, more and more, I think countries are thinking of semiconductors as a national security priority, not simply as an input into electronics. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that, where countries are quite strategic about pursuing semiconductors. I think there's only a couple of years that you have where the value chains are actually in motion and in play. Of course, everyone and their brother is trying to get into semiconductors right now. Vietnam actually do it? I think so. I mean, we've seen a lot of great deals already happen in Vietnam. And so there's a good chance that we'll actually bring some of the global supply chain to Vietnam, and I'm excited about the prospects for semiconductors. We've only seen India is really the only one that so far has already been able to move from nothing to something in semiconductors, and I think we may see Vietnam pull that off as well. So those are my thoughts on those two.
Yeah, really interesting. I think for me the provincial merger, just from a almost like mundane, like where stuff is going to be, viewpoint is like just fascinating. Like I mean, I've told some friends who don't really follow the news very much here about it, and they're like, "What do you mean?" I'll be like, like Tao Dian is not going to exist anymore as a name, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" Like, yeah, it's just going to be gone. although they were voting on it in my local Zalo chat the other day and everyone voted to keep it. I don't really know. I don't think that means very much, but it's going to be a little weird just for addresses and things. But yeah, clearly there's too many. I know on the environmental side, like this has been an issue in the Mekong Delta for years because you have like 12 provinces in a relatively small area and they all act as their own little fiefdom. And it's like, well, we're going to do stuff for the river to our boundary. And then whatever happens after that, well, that's the other province's problem. Yeah. So, I mean, it's got amazing how many balls are in the air right now in terms of, I mean, the issues we've discussed here over the last 30 minutes. There's others we haven't even gotten to, all within the context, obviously, of the Trump administration and, multiple wars going on and lots of significant global issues, to put it mildly. But certainly as someone who's maybe a little more cynical at times, talking about myself, it is heartening to see that the government clearly recognizes so much of these issues and is working. Again, I know it can be easy to be cynical when Ho Chi Minh City's second metro line is still not even progressing at all and that sort of thing. But big picture, there's certainly a lot to be positive about at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I do, I'm always grateful. And I of course have read your weekly for many years now. Right. And so I'm deeply grateful for the, making sure that we're constantly taking a not necessarily cynical, but critical view of what's happening and what isn't happening. There are loads and loads of challenges in Vietnam. But I guess the way I would look at it is I don't think there's any more exciting place on the planet to be right now. Progress is indisputable, right? The numbers do speak for themselves. You look at the millions of people lifted out of poverty. If you look at sort of the economic results, and if you look at the pace and speed of development, of course, there's loads of projects, and infrastructure is not their strong suit here. I'll grant you that. There's everything that takes 3 or 4 times as long and costs twice as much as it's supposed to. But somehow it all still keeps getting bigger and better, right? So important to ensure that we look at this through the lens of the big picture. And as somebody who lives here and deals with the difficulties of getting things done on a day-to-day basis, sometimes I can appreciate that it's easy to get cynical or to get frustrated with government and its lack of progress on certain things. But I keep coming back to, if any friend of yours, any Vietnamese friend of yours who's in their 20s is significantly better off than their parents, and their parents were significantly better off than their parents, right? So we've got at least 2 generations of radical improvements for almost everybody in Vietnam. And if we can get a 3rd generation of that, we will be nearly a fully developed country. So I try to keep backing up and looking at the big picture.
Yeah, no, it's a good perspective because in the big picture, it is incredible what they've achieved here. I mean, truly, world beating levels of poverty eradication and electrification and cell phone coverage. And, it's so weird going to visit the US and you'll be in a city and be like, I don't have data for some reason in this like random block.
Well, even like there's so many ways when you're a developing country, you can actually do this leapfrogging thing on so many things, right? And I look at like QR payments here, or like transferring money to a friend here. And it's like in the US, I got like, they'll take a checkbook out or something stupid like that. Like why is this, so much easier in Vietnam to move money around than it is in the US, right?
Yeah, I've had some visiting friends watch me do that and be like, wait, so you just sent money? I'm like, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So anyway, Rich, I don't want to take up much more of your time. Seems like you were getting phone calls as we speak. So I appreciate you taking some time out of your morning. I mean, lots of, big topics here, all of which are going to be extremely relevant for years, I would assume. So thanks again for sharing some of your thoughts.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Mike. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and see you next time.